Okay, we're on Unit 6 preparation now of the EOCT and U.S. History. Unit 6 is going to cover Standard 14, Standard 15, and Standard 16. Becoming a world power is what we're going to talk about. The United States is going to become a world power around 1898, 1900. Standard 14 has, we've already discussed the Chinese Exclusion Act in the last unit. That was 14A. We're going to do 14B and 14C here. And Standard 14, let's go ahead and jump in it. The student will explain America's evolving relationship with the world at the turn of the 20th century. The United States will become a world power and will leave its old neutrality under Washington and then become more expansionist and then go outside of the borders of the continental United States out into the Pacific Ocean and into Central America and the Caribbean. We're going to get to that. Alright, so describe the Spanish-American War, the war in the Philippines, and the debate over American expansionism. So that's three different things there. If we sit here and slowly read it, and you can pause this and read it if you want to. And let's remember, we have to focus on the language of the standards, and we have to really get out what the standards want us to know in order for us to be prepared for the EOCT, and that requires close reading to understand. So I see here we have three focuses. The first one is we need to, let's see what we need to do. The key word here is to describe. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to describe the Spanish-American War first. That's our first objective. And then we're going to describe the Philippine-American War. And then we're going to describe the arguments over American expansion. So our theme here is expansion of the United States. The continental United States has absorbed manifest destiny all the way to the west. We discussed that in the last unit. Now we're going to expand beyond our borders. Okay, so the Spanish-American War, the war in the Philippines, and the arguments over expansion. Let's go ahead and jump into this first part. Describe the Spanish-American War. And I've given you a timeline here you can look at. From 1898 to 1902, the Spanish-American War will be fought. Actually, the Spanish-American War only lasts 114 days. So I think it's about, I can't remember, let's see, 6 months? Yeah. It's going to be so short of a period of time that the Secretary of State, John Hay, here is going to refer to the Spanish-American War as a splendid little war. Lasted for 6 months or 114 days with very minimal casualties, not many at all. And it's going to start up here, and we're going to go through this as I describe it to you. Maybe you can look it over and pause and kind of get where on this timeline what's happening. Alright, so what we're essentially going to talk about, here's the continental United States. It had absorbed itself. Now the United States is going to go beyond its borders, go against what George Washington said to do, is just stay within your continent and grow. But at this time we had stretched across the country with manifest destiny. And at this point in time, we're going to talk about at the turn of the 20th century how we get involved with Cuba and eventually gain property out here at first in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico. We're going to own it at the end of this. And we're going to own Hawaii, and we're going to own this little small island Guam, and for a little brief period of time we're going to own the Philippines. So we're going to expand out in here, and we're going to find out why in the Pacific Ocean out here, and in the Caribbean here, and then eventually in Latin America or Central America here, why we expand out into those territories and how that's going to eventually pull us into something we really didn't want to be in. But anyway, John Hay said it was a splendid little war. It all started out in 1895 when the Cuban people started rebelling against their mother country, Spain. And Jose Marti was a Cuban revolutionist who was very instrumental in Cuba fighting for its independence. Spain, in response to Cuban Revolution for Independence, sent a General Weyler, and he became known as General Butcher Weyler in the news tabloids in the United States, but sent 150,000 troops to put down a rebellion in Cuba. And when General Weyler gets there, he sets up these concentration camps for Cubans, and there's children in there. It's really bad conditions, a lot of starving, a lot of death caused by starvation. And so Jose Marti appeals to the United States for help and doesn't really get a good audience for that because we're a neutral country. We try to stay out of foreign people's affairs. But down here in Cuba, a lot of American businessmen had invested a lot of money in these sugar plantations in Cuba. So Jose Marti here attacked those Cuban sugar plantations that American money was in, and this in turn caused businesses that had money put into those sugar plantations to actually put pressure on the United States government to declare war against Cuba. So Jose Marti was instrumental in getting the United States' attention by targeting the business area. At any rate, on January 25th, 1898, the United States sent a 7,000-ton naval vessel called the USS Maine, United States ship Maine, down to Havana, Cuba, on a visit that was called a friendly courtesy, just going there to check things out. And then 3 weeks later, the USS Maine explodes in the Havana harbor, and it's going to kill 260 U.S. sailors. Okay. At the time, two New York newspaper owners, one was William Randolph Hearst, the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World, were in this furious battle over circulation, who would have the most circulation in the United States. And so in fighting for that, they vigorously on a daily basis report on what's going on in Cuba, and they paint Spain and General Weyler out to be a butcher and all these horrible incidents that are going on. It's something we refer to as yellow journalism, or sensationalized or exaggerated reporting by these newspapers to get the attention of the readers. And this yellow journalism kind of encouraged the United States to support Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. And with the explosion of the Maine, it's going to be sensationalized as well. And when it is blown up, it's blamed on Spain. In the headlines in Spain, they talk about to heck with Spain, remember the Maine, and they pull the United States into war. And the United States eventually enters the Spanish-American War to help Cuba win its independence from Spain. And so the explosion of Maine happened in 1898, and we said that date was January 25th, 1898, and in April 25th of 1898, the United States declared war. Okay, so we enter what becomes known as the Spanish-American War. As a result, we get a lot of these Pacific Ocean claims, and in the Caribbean here we get Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands by 1917, but America Samoa 1899, and Guam over here 1898, Philippines 1898. So in 1898, May 1st, the Battle of Manila Bay happens, and Admiral Dewey comes down from China or Hong Kong, comes in and attacks here in May 1st, 1898, and destroys the Spanish fleet. It doesn't end it doesn't end the occupation of the Philippines, but he destroys the Spanish fleet there May 1st, 1898. It won't be until August 13, 1898 that Manila surrenders to the United States. Okay. So Guam is captured on June 21st. And if we look, Guam is right here. I've highlighted it for you and put a little red mark there for you so you can see it. So in 1898, we capture Guam. And then on July 1st, or June 22nd, U.S. troops land in Cuba. We had the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1st, 1898. And then July 17th, Santiago is captured. So Cuba kind of buckles and gives in. And let's look there. Here's Cuba. Here's Santiago here, and here's where the Battle of San Juan Hill happened in July of 1898 here. And there at San Juan Hill, a national hero comes about. His name is Theodore Roosevelt. He retired as assistant to the Secretary of Navy, I believe. And then he becomes a leader of the Rough Riders group that went to San Juan Hill here and rushed that hill and take it. And he becomes a hero there after winning the Battle of San Juan Hill, becomes a national hero. Later he's going to be elected President of the United States. Okay, so there's that. During this occupation of Cuba and capturing Santiago in July 7th, 1898, totally unrelated to the Spanish-American War, totally unrelated to it, Hawaii is annexed to the United States. So Hawaii becomes a territory of the United States, July 7th, 1898. This is a part of what we call imperialism or expansionism, but not part of the Spanish-American War. So we get Hawaii, that island Hawaii, and here's Hawaii here in the picture out here in the Pacific Ocean. It's going to become very important later on. It's eventually going to become a state in the United States later. Okay, so then in July 25th, 1898, Puerto Rico is invaded and taken. And if we look, here's Puerto Rico right here. Here's Florida. There's Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Here's the Puerto Rico out here in the Caribbean. See, so we capture Puerto Rico, which would later become part of the United States. All right, then on August the 13th of 1898, Manila Bay is captured and the Spanish surrender there. So over here, so we take the Philippines out in the Pacific Ocean. Now, if you look, the Philippines are way over here near China. Okay. Okay, so let's see. The Treaty of Paris is going to be signed in 1898, bringing the end of the Spanish-American War. And in that treaty, Spain cedes Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. So Puerto Rico and Guam become territories of the United States. So let's look. There's Puerto Rico, that little red dot there. And here's Guam, this little island over here in the Pacific. Okay. And then Spain recognized Cuban independence. So Cuba becomes its own country. Okay. The only thing in the agreement that was put in there, it was, let's see, the Platt Amendment, I believe, is that on the island here at Guantanamo Bay, on this end here, that an American naval base could be built there. Okay. And then Spain ceded the Philippine Islands to the United States for $20 million. So the United States takes the Philippines over here, makes it part of its territory, and pays $20 million to Spain for that territory. So the Treaty of Paris 1898 ends the Spanish-American War. That's all we needed, was another Treaty of Paris 1898. The Treaty of Paris 1763 ended the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris 1783 ended the American Revolutionary War. Now we have a Treaty of Paris 1898 that ends the Spanish-American War. Okay. Now, if you recall, we just described the Spanish-American War. That's it. Now we have to describe the war in the Philippines. We're not going to go too far into that. Let's go ahead and do it. So, in 1899, June 2nd, the Filipino Rebellion happens. The Philippine-American War occurs, in other words, because we purchased the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, but the Filipino people wanted us to leave. But we refused to leave. We instead stayed in the Philippines and took it as a territory. Alright, so, and it's going to last for 3 years until 1902, the end of the Filipino War. It actually lasts longer than the Spanish-American War. The resistance in the Philippines in the Philippine-American War is put up by the president there, Emilio Aguinaldo, this guy here. At the end of the Philippine-American War, 3 years later, huge death toll. American deaths, there's 4,000 American deaths. The Filipino rebels, they're going to be 16,000 to 20,000 deaths there. And then the citizens of the Philippines, over 200,000 deaths to disease and starvation during the Philippine-American War. So this was not a light war happened here between the Philippines trying to get their independence from the United States. So as a result of the Philippine-American War, these arguments come up about imperialism. And we talked about imperialism before. The United States was subjected to imperialism while they were colonies of Great Britain. But let's look at the definition of imperialism. Territorial relationship in the form of an empire, based on superiority and dominance, and involving the extension of authority and control of one state or people over another. It is often considered in a negative light It's merely the exploitation of native people in order to enrich a small handful. In other words, imperialism, we talk about the American colonies during King George III of Great Britain. They were an empire and they were trying to subject us to get our natural resources from us to help benefit the mother country, Great Britain. But anyway, the characteristics here are the United States is going to own Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Philippines, and Guam. And that's the example of imperialism. And here's the examples. Cuba was an independent nation. Even though we forced them to put an American naval base in Guantanamo Bay, they were still an independent nation and were not part of the United States, so they wouldn't be considered an example of imperialism, although we wanted them. Synonymous with imperialism is expansionism, but expansionism really refers to our foreign policy to expand beyond the United States, continental United States, and to locate new markets for us to sell goods and to get raw materials from beyond the continental United States for surplus products by gaining economic influence over foreign countries. So it's synonymous with it, but not exactly the same thing. We wanted to gain influence over Cuba and expand there with our markets and control foreign government policy there, invest in sugar plantations, which we had already done, and sell goods to Cuban citizens. And there's some examples. Some non-examples would be totally neutral and isolated from worldly affairs like we used to be. Now we've gone into this. But anyway, our third thing we're supposed to do with 14B is describe the debate over American expansionism. So it is here where we get into this big debate in the United States. Should we expand into Latin America? Should we expand into the Caribbean? Should we expand into the Pacific Ocean? Half the country says yes, the other half says no. You know, and the proponents are people who wanted us to expand. They said that it would allow us to increase our trade, improve our economy. If you remember in 1893, George Pullman had problems in the Pullman strike, Pullman Cart Company, because we had a national recession. Our economy was down. So these people are proponents who believe we should expand into new markets, believed our economy would grow and prosper, that it would offer security for the United States and our trade would improve, and the empire, we would go to become an empire. So the proponents said yes. The opponents, the people against expansion, say no, we're a republic, we're not an empire, that we have ideals such as freedom and liberty and home rule, government by the consent of the government. No, we should not expand into these foreign lands. So let's look at this first argument, and let's look at a few cartoons in the newspaper at the time and some of the statements that were made. The proponents, people say, yeah, let's expand. Okay, the arguments for expansion. They're really for. Okay, so they said we should do this because we can expand our business interests. The U.S. economy boomed and was doing great. Now it's in a decline, and these companies were building overseas factories, and they needed new markets to prevent a financial panic like happened in 1893. And so some of those goods we looked at a few moments ago: bananas and fish, timber, coffee, sugar, cocoa, and tobacco were a lot of these out in here. And in Hawaii, you know, pineapples and a few other fruits that we could use. And then military interest. International competition for colonies would leave America behind. In other words, the rest of the world is involved in this imperialism and expanding out, getting these natural resources. The United States needed to compete in that too, and that is international competition for colonies. And in 1890, the United States Congress funding approved for 3 battleships, and for the United States to become a 2-ocean navy, have a navy large enough to go in the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Caribbean to protect the United States or advance business interests beyond. An international navy needs coaling ports. In other words, coal is what was the energy source to send these big navy vessels throughout the ocean. They needed these ports to put coal out, places where they could put naval bases to have this 2-ocean navy. And let's look for a minute first at this expand business interest right here. U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge said, "Duty and interest alike duty of the highest kind and interest of the highest and best kind, impose on us the retention of the Philippines, the development of the islands, and the expansion of our eastern commerce. And what did he mean by eastern commerce? What he meant was, and the reason why some people thought we were doing this, is to China here had a lot of resources, and we wanted to tap into this trade with China and use China as a way. There were a lot of people there to sell our goods to, and to also get what we didn't have from China. So to open up China to trade, we needed a large navy that could, police and move about in the Caribbean, but also the Atlantic Ocean, but also this huge Pacific Ocean. We needed to have these little coal imports like in Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines and a few other islands to help us get across this great expansive ocean to get to China, to open up trade with China. And the reason being, the United States had absorbed all its markets and it was in an economic panic in 1893 to 1900. And a cartoon at the time really shows, that interest was. It shows here's the United States, continental United States. Here's the Philippines. Here's China here. And look what Uncle Sam's taken across, Education and religion, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But look at the bridges, the railroad here. You see the train. Some of our mowing machines or harvesters. In other words, we're going to come over here and sell a lot of these goods to China. And then we're going to have them as a market to sell goods to, but also to get goods from them we don't have. But a lot of people thought this, and U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge said we need to expand our eastern commerce. So that was a large part of this, is to get across that ocean. Okay. Another senator, U.S. Senator Albert Beveridge, said we are today raising more than we can consume. Today we're making more than we can use. Therefore, we must find new markets. He says it right there. We must find new markets for our produce, new occupation for our capital, new work for our labor, in other words, work for people to do. Think of the thousands of Americans who were poured into Hawaii and Puerto Rico when the Republic's laws cover those islands with justice and safety. Think of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who will build a soap and water, common school civilization of energy and industry in Cuba when a government of law replaces the double reign of anarchy and tyranny. So he's talking here about opening up new markets and jobs and stuff for American people. So we see that. And now this military interest here, one of the reasons they said we needed to expand is because we needed this military to help protect the United States. And an influence there was Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was with the Navy, who wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in it, he says the United States really needs a two-ocean navy, a large, powerful navy to help protect itself and to expand into new markets. And so he said we needed a navy that can get out in here and open up these markets, but also protect the United States and give it national security. And then, let's see, we see the spread of civilization, Christianity and democracy. Americans had this sense of superiority that we needed to go out into the Philippines and all these other nations to spread our Christianity and democracy to them. All nations should be Christian, democratic, bring values and democracy to a backward people. I almost want to start talking about, Winthrop's City Upon a Hill again. I'm not going to do that, but to show the world we're a beacon of progress. And I think that's what a lot of Americans thought they would do. And then the American frontier had closed, and we needed to look for foreign interest in expanding this, explore beyond. And we looked to President William McKinley at the time, and he says we needed to compete internationally. Without competition, we would be clinging to the clumsy, antiquated process of farming and manufacture and the methods of business of long ago. And the 20th would be no further advanced than the 18th century. Okay, and a cartoon at the time shows Uncle Sam here competing and gambling here in this international competition for colonies. You see Puerto Rico there and Cuba. and here's all the other European nations. So we needed to get into this international competition. Another thing the president said is that, in the argument here to support what we said earlier, is that we need to uplift, civilize, and Christianize these people. He says we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. So in the newspapers there was another cartoon that showed this, showing the light to the Filipinos. And here's the Filipino, and this is an individual citizen from the Philippines. Freedom, education, justice, and commerce, civilization. See, and this where the proponents are saying that the United States needed to civilize these people before they set themselves on the way to freedom. And here's another one here. Ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, oppression. And it shows Uncle Sam here with the red cross here. In other words, he's a good citizen for carrying these ignorant people from Cuba and the Philippines and Hawaii and all up this mountain through slavery and cruelty and all to the main goal up here, civilization. Okay. And it shows Great Britain is also doing it in India and other places of the world. And so we see this Victorian idea that we should help these poor ignorant people who don't have a clue as to how to live a civilized world like we do. Rudyard Kipling, a European British poet, wrote A White Man's Burden, advocating the United States should stay in the Philippines, should stay in these islands to help these people become more civilized. He says, take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. In other words, they're half devil and half child, too ignorant. You need to go out there, and that's the burden we have, this obligation to civilize these people who are not civilized. Here's a cartoon here that depicts the Uncle Sam here tied to this tree out in the Philippines, imperialism word there. Here's the Philippines, and this cartoon depicts the people of the Philippines as an ignorant and stubborn people, like a donkey. And it's insinuating it is the U.S. that should tame or civilize this wild beast. And over here it has this character looks like Uncle Sam with a badge that says $20 million in it. That's how much they paid for the Philippines. And this is by Winsor McKay in 1899. President William McKinley also said that we needed to spread democracy. Illiteracy must be banished from the land if we shall attain that high destiny as the foremost of the enlightened nations of the world, which, under providence, we ought to achieve. In other words, we have an obligation to spread democracy there, spread religion there, and to civilize these heathens. And here's another proponents of expansion here, showing up here how they were under yokes of slavery and how bad they had it, Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And then after the United States takes them, it says after the United States has rescued them from their oppression, how much better they are because of it. They're learning, they can read, they're making money. And so the cartoon portrays that the people imperialized by the United States are better off than they were in the before the Spanish-American War, so that we did actually help them. And in Hawaii, which was not part of the Spanish-American War, President William McKinley says we need Hawaii just as much and a good deal more than we did California. It is manifest destiny. So we still see this word manifest destiny thrown around in expansion outside the continent of the United States. And we see it's because a lot of these products, there's a lot of pineapples, and Dole Pineapple Company was a United States business that went there trying to make money. And a proponent in the newspapers also put that the United States has been expansionist ever since the beginning, and it talks about how it spread into Louisiana, bought France from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and then in 1819 how the Adams-Onis Treaty, we took Florida from Spain. and then 1861 how Texas became independent, called as the Civil War, and then in 1898 shows here in 1898 the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, how we freed them. So down here it says showing how Uncle Sam has been an expansionist first, last, and all the time. So the proponents argue we've always been expansionist. And then there's the argument against those people who said we should not expand into the Pacific or Latin America. And their main argument was that if we did, it would violate what America stands for. It would violate the rule of consent of the governed that we had in our own Declaration of Independence. It would violate our self-determination and anti-colonialism. And Filipinos should be given their own government. Our commitment to freedom would be violated if we didn't. And here's a cartoon of the American eagle with his claws sink into Central America, and down here at the bottom it says his 128th birthday, meaning the 4th of July, and then it says G, but this is an awful stretch because we had see the flags in the Philippines and in Panama and over in Puerto Rico, and it's implying here that we're hypocrites, that we ourselves have independence but we didn't give it to these islands, so this implies hypocrisy. So the American flags that go up, yeah, okay, there you go. Here's one here that suggests President McKinley's acting like an emperor. So this is Emperor of the U.S. This is President William McKinley, has imperialism around here. This guy here, his name is William Jennings Bryan. He is against expansionism. He was a presidential candidate in 1900, the Democrat. And here's what he wrote. Shall we contemplate a scheme for the colonization of the Orient merely because our ships won a remarkable victory in the harbor of Manila? He's talking about Manila Bay in the Philippines, where Admiral Dewey defeated the Spanish Navy. It says, our guns destroyed a Spanish fleet, but can they destroy that self-evident truth that governments derive their just powers not from superior force, but from the consent of the governed? He quotes here the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, and he was a Democratic presidential candidate in 1900, so he opposes expansion. And here's a cartoon showing President McKinley with his foot on top of a Filipino, and it asks the question, is he to be a despot? And you have Julius Caesar over here and Napoleon Bonaparte here. And here's one here of the where McKinley said we needed to civilize these people because they were not civilized. Here's one where proponents of civilization needs to begin at home, saying that us taking their ability to be free and to govern themselves is uncivilized. So this is countering the argument made by McKinley that we should uplift, civilize the Filipinos and educate them. And here's one here. I like this one. There's a lot of symbolism in this one. We see the African American over here being forced to work, symbolizes slavery. He's not over here getting an education. And we see the Native American isolated and reserved and put on a reservation over here. This is the history of the United States. And here's an African American kid that was not allowed to get an education. And then we have these islands up here being educated by Uncle Sam, civilized and uplifted. Okay, so a lot of symbolism here, and you can read this, pause it, and read it, what I've written down here at the bottom to get a better understanding of this. And then here's one where Uncle Sam's just plotting out the lands he wants. And here's a proponent showing he's just at the table cutting from all these islands. And here's William McKinley, our president, is going to serve him up to Uncle Sam. Here it shows him as a greedy pig, stealing places in the earth, stop thief, he wants the earth. And then there's our old boot in the Philippines showing that we're heavy-footed with them. Here's one shows an anti-expansionist policy trying to give him an elixir to help him out. His belly swole up from expansionism. And this is President McKinley here tailoring the suit for Uncle Sam. Okay. And here's one here that shows Uncle Sam stretched out here, and in his hand it's got 1776, the Declaration of Independence, Roosevelt platform, imperialism, administration, repeal of the Declaration of Independence, autocracy, aristocracy, plutocracy, and feudalism. So it's pretty much saying that, you know, even Teddy Roosevelt was against these countries having their own freedom. Goes against what our country was founded on, consent of the government. And here's a response to Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, and it shows how much it would cost for the military to stay in those areas, and the claims for pensions for the soldiers and all, and how much we paid for the Philippines. It says, we have taken up the white man's burden of ebony and brown. Now will you tell us, Rudyard, how will we put it down? In other words, it's going to cost a lot of money to take up this burden. We really can't afford that. It's really going to make us worse off than we already are. So these are opponents. And here's one I like too. It shows you the arguments that come about, and this is a quote for Lincoln's House Divided speech. We assert that no nation can long endure half republic and half empire, and we warn the American people that imperialism will lead quickly and inevitably to despotism at home. National Democratic Platform in 1900. Mark Twain said, I am an anti-imperialist. I'm opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. And you can pause this and read his quote here about the Philippines and all. I'm not going to read it all to you, but if I were you, I would read this. Mark Twain was an anti-expansionist. And then another person here, Samuel Gompers, says he was opposed to imperialism and expansion. He thought it was repugnant to the Republican institutions, a menace to liberty of our own people, and that we shouldn't deny to them what we claim for ourselves, the right of self-government. And he made that speech as president of AFL in 1898. So the end result is we get Guam, we get the Philippines, we get Puerto Rico over here, and eventually we're going to target the Panama Canal. So we get all these lands. What's important to remember here is the change, this dramatic change that occurs, that most of the 19th century we were a continental republic, that we focused on selling the western frontier and building democratic institutions, and that we followed carefully George Washington's warning that we should avoid entangling alliance, stay neutral, and stay within the continental United States. But we changed to become an imperial republic with interest in Caribbean and Latin America and in the Pacific, with all those lands in Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii. And we see here, as we're going to reference to in the future, that our U.S. foreign policy is going to change. From 1789 to 1898, we were neutrality under George Washington's warnings. But in 1898 to 1919 and during the World War I, we become this expansionist nation. I think it's this turn to expansionism that actually throws us into the into the World War I, because we go beyond our borders and we leave neutrality and get involved in worldly affairs. This international competition of imperialism and expansionism. It's going to put us in a position where we enter World War I. And then after World War I, we're going to return to isolationism. We're going to talk about this in the future, but we're going to watch this change in foreign policy as we go. And President William McKinley, he says, one of his quotes is, in a few short months we have become a world power. And with that, I think we have, I know this is a long video, but this is a very complicated thing to learn about. So did we describe the Spanish-American War? Yes, we did. Did we just talk about the war in the Philippines? Yes. And the debate of American expansionism? We have. If you got any questions, ask them in class. Rewatch the video. Good luck on the test and the EOCT. Describe the Spanish-American War first. That's our first objective. And then we're going to describe the Philippine-American War. And then we're going to describe the arguments over American expansion. So our theme here is expansion of the United States. The continental United States has absorbed manifest destiny all the way to the west. We discussed that in the last unit. Now we're going to expand beyond our borders. Okay, so the Spanish-American War, the war in the Philippines, and the arguments over expansion. Let's go ahead and jump into this first part. Describe the Spanish-American War. And I've given you a timeline here you can look at. From 1898 to 1902, the Spanish-American War will be fought. Actually, the Spanish-American become more expansionist and then go outside of the borders of the continental United States out into the Pacific Ocean and into Central America and the Caribbean. We're going to get to that. Alright, so describe the Spanish-American War, the war in the Philippines, and the debate over American expansionism. So that's three different things there. If we sit here and slowly read it, and you can pause this and read it if you want to. And let's remember, we have to focus on the language of the standards, and we have to really get out what the standards want us to know in order for us to be prepared for the EOCT, and that requires close reading to understand. So I see here we have three focuses. The first one is we need to, let's see what we need to do. The key word here is to describe. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to, just this point in time, we're going to talk about at the turn of the 20th century, how we get involved with Cuba and eventually gain property out here at first in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico. We're going to own it at the end of this, and we're going to own Hawaii, and we're going to own this little small island Guam, and for a little brief period of time we're going to own Philippines. So we're going to expand out in here, and we're going to find out why in the Pacific Ocean out here, and in the Caribbean here, and then eventually in Latin America or Central America here, why we expand out into those territories and how that's going to eventually pull us into something we really didn't want to be in. But anyway, John Hay said it was a splendid little war. It all started out in 1895 when the Cuban people started rebelling against their... Okay. We're on Unit 6 preparation now of the EOCT and U.S. history. Unit 6 is going to cover Standard 14, Standard 15, and Standard 16. Becoming a world power is what we're going to talk about. The United States is going to become a world power around 1898, 1900. Standard 14 has, we've already discussed the Chinese Exclusion Act in the last unit. That was 14A. We're going to do 14B and 14C here. And Standard 14, let's go ahead and jump in it. The student will explain America's evolving relationship with the world at the turn of the 20th century. The United States will become a world power and will leave its old neutrality under Washington and then become, well, that's 114 days. So I think it's about, I can't remember, let's see, 6 months? Yeah. It's going to be so short of a period of time that the Secretary of State, John Hay here, is going to refer to the Spanish-American War as a splendid little war. Lasted for 6 months or 114 days with very minimal casualties, not many at all. And it's going to start up here, and we're going to go through this as I describe it to you. Maybe you can look it over and pause and kind of get where on this timeline what's happening. Alright, so what we're essentially going to talk about, here's the continental United States. It had absorbed itself. Now the United States is going to go beyond its borders, go against what George Washington said to do, is just stay within your continent and grow. But at this time we had stretched across the country with manifest destiny. And it's